Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Beyond the Indus. I'm your host, Tushar Shetty. So, last episode, we spoke with Vice Admiral R.B. Pandit about India's naval strategy and maritime posture. And today, we're going to turn our attention to the land domain. On paper, India has the second largest army in the world. But India's military is at a bit of an inflection point. Operation Sindoor offered a glimpse of what modern conflict looks like on the subcontinent, but it also raises some hard questions about the gaps it exposed and whether India's armed forces are structurally equipped for wars ahead in an age where conflicts like Ukraine and Sindoor, and of course the Iran conflict, dictate the rules on the battlefield. My guest today to discuss these issues is Colonel Ajai Shukla, one of India's most authoritative and independent voices on defense. He served in the Indian Army's Armored Corps for over 2 decades, and he commanded one of its most decorated tank regiments before becoming a war correspondent and strategic affairs editor at the Business Standard, and has reported from conflict zones like Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. He writes for The Diplomat, The New York Times, and The Guardian. He lectures at India's three services war colleges and runs Broadsword, one of India's most widely read defense blogs. He's also completing a book for Penguin that takes a hard look at the structures and battle readiness of India's military. So, no one better we could have to discuss the future of India's army modernization. So, Colonel Shukla, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Well, Tushar, it's a very great pleasure to be with such an illustrious blog, and I look forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. So, Colonel Shukla, to start with, you've written extensively about how Ukraine has transformed our understanding of modern land warfare. And in the past year, India has faced its own conflict with Pakistan, where it carried out Operation Sindoor, which is ostensibly still ongoing. I wonder, in your view, how successful was or perhaps is Operation Sindoor from an operations standpoint? And as someone who's spent years studying both conflicts, what are the most consequential lessons that India's army should be internalizing from these two conflicts right now?
Well, that's pretty much sums up many of the dilemmas that are troubling defense planners now. And the sort of race, as it were, between technology and the actual equipment that is used is something that is increasingly important and which increasingly decides the outcomes of issues like the war between Ukraine and Russia that's sort of been exercising all of us over the last 5 years. So, the death of the tank, for example, has been predicted from almost from the time that the tank was born in the First World War. And what we find is that while a lot of people make very good points and a lot of soldiers actually fight those points on the battlefield, the actual death of the tank does not take place because there are always counters and counter-counters that come into play. And you feel at a certain point in time that, let's say, an unarmed sort of drone with certain specific capabilities is actually sort of something that is going to change the very look of the battlefield. You always find that after some time a counter comes about and you go on to business as usual with slightly changed parameters. So the war in Ukraine was a perfect example of this, as you yourself bring out. The tanks that were initially deployed in the battlefield at that time were under severe pressure at the early stages of the war. And it was becoming sort of evident that something would have to change because the level of casualties that were sort of being undergone were not sustainable. The tanks are able to sustain up to a certain point of time and up to a certain casualty level. But then, the Ukrainians came up with counters, and the high levels of casualties that were being caused at that time started diminishing. It was one of the sort of big questions at that time about whether this would be sustainable for a longer period of time or not. But then the drones came in. And counter-drone UAVs came in, and as a result of which there were sort of countermeasures that sort of transformed the battlefield. So I think that this remains an ongoing struggle and an ongoing argument. The Russians, as all historians and aficionados of military history know, have suffered sort of casualties in tank warfare, particularly during the First World War, that really nobody else sort of seems to even be able to contemplate those levels of casualties.
The Second World War, you mean the famous meat grinder?
Did I say First World War?
Sorry. Yeah, First World, but
I meant Second World War. So, in battles like the Kursk and in many of the battlefields that are being sort of fought over today between Russia and Ukraine, these were all sort of lessons that were drawn, that translated into certain tactical innovations by the Russians and so on. The Germans themselves, from where you're talking, were great innovators in tank warfare. But at the end of it, the battlefield tends to stabilize, and as has happened in this particular case, and we wait to see what sort of direction tank warfare moves in the future.
I wonder if you could talk about, in light of the experiences from Ukraine, this idea of Operation Sindoor. I must confess, I have some difficulty understanding what the parameters of Operation Sindoor are. Was it just a new tactic or a new approach during the Pakistan conflict? Is it sort of a long-term strategy that consists of multiple facets that may not involve overt conflict? What is Operation Sindoor, and how effective is it as from an operational sense?
That's a very sort of interesting question. And it goes to the heart of India-Pakistan relations. The Sindoor itself is a red powder that is worn by sort of very devout Hindu women on their forehead, and just sort of making a mark that is visible as a sign of being a married woman, and being sort of thereby sort of being how should I put this? Being responsible and being sort of accepting of the duties of a Hindu married woman. Now, the Indian government, when it retaliated during this particular incident that we are sort of talking about now, the Indian sort of women wanted to be, or were sort of required by the government to be co-opted into the sort of conflict between terrorism, terrorists, the new forms of warfare, especially the forms of warfare that were being adapted by and adopted by Islamist terrorist groups. So Prime Minister Modi wanted to rally the country behind this particular group, and therefore he named it Operation Sindoor. This is controversial. This is not something that is widely accepted by everyone, because there is an element of religiosity about it. But suffice to say that the name was given as Sindoor to this particular, counterattack that the sort of Indian military was doing as a consequence of that sort of terrorist attack that they were retaliating against, and therefore it was sort of taken forward and called Sindoor. I don't know when history is written whether this will be still sort of as controversial, but right now there is a certain sort of feel to it in religious terms that may not sustain in history. But as it was played out, Operation Sindoor was launched in retaliation to a terrorist strike by Pakistan-affiliated groups, and that is the way it went forward. That's the way it sort of was countered by Pakistan, which also gave their retaliation a certain religiosity, and that's where it stands right now. The sort of overt fighting under this label is not going on any further. That was called off at a certain stage, but that's how it played out in the early stages.
So more a framing, for don't want to say propaganda, but a framing technique, shall we say, for what would be pretty standard battlefield tactics. Nothing new in terms of Indian military strategy.
There certainly is no tactical innovation to this particular label, Sindoor. It is more a sort of a question of rallying behind the flag, rallying behind sort of Hindu sort of pride in a way. And that is why it was sort of perhaps after a period of time it felt that it served its purpose. And you heard less about Sindoor. But this is how it came about, and this is the sort of implications of how it was taken forward.
Right. And I mentioned in the introduction that, on paper, India has the second largest armed forces in the world, and perhaps one of the largest just by pure personnel terms. But manpower consumes a substantial chunk of India's defense budget. And you've argued that this is problematic in that it crowds out expenditure for capital and equipment modernization in an age where increasingly technology plays a bigger part on the battlefield. The government's answer to this problem has been the Agnipath scheme, which you've also been critical of. I wonder if you could explain for our listeners what exactly the Agnipath scheme entails and why, in your view, it doesn't adequately address the manpower versus modernization conundrum, and what might be a better way to solve this issue, in your opinion?
Well, that's a sort of one of the big discussion points that drives doctrine and outcomes of doctrine in the Indian military right now. You're absolutely right. It is the second biggest, depending on how you count, military in the world, but that amounts to a land forces of somewhere in the region of 1.3 million soldiers. They cover a land border of some 15,000 kilometers, most of it with China and Pakistan. Both of them powerful, well-armed, well-trained, hostile states. And compared to this 1.4 kilometers or 1.3 billion kilometers, there is a smaller maritime border. That's the Indian peninsula that sticks out into the Indian Ocean. That's a border of about 7,500 kilometers for India. And then there are these other smaller states like Myanmar, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal. They make up a smaller component of the border. As America has shifted its attention to the Asia Pacific and particularly to the Indo-Pacific maritime theater, the United States has put great store by giving India a sort of a major role, as it were, as one of the bulwarks of opposition against China, knowing well that America itself would have a limited ability to fight in the Indo-Pacific, and that the Indian Navy, for example, would be a sort of an invaluable partner and a partner that had to be brought in somehow in order to build up the numbers that are required to confront this new Chinese threat. So, as a consequence of that, India has become one of the sort of, let's say, the forward posts of this Western alliance against China. India is one of the sort of the forward posts, as we put it, and its land border with China gets comparatively less attention, but the land border with China is actually what exercises India the most, and what Indian military units are most occupied in protecting. So you could have sort of, let's say, the AUKUS grouping, Australia, UK, and US, very sort of satisfied with the way that they have put together their sort of resistance and opposition to Chinese military sort of units and naval units in the Indo-Pacific, but which still leaves India extremely vulnerable to China, which is an even bigger army, and Pakistan, which leaves them vulnerable to attack by those countries. So India has to have this constant juggle, this constant sort of compromise formula between its troops on the land border with China and its troops on the other land borders that it has, and other maritime borders as well. So that's one of the reasons why the use of a large number of troops, Indian troops, like you were mentioning in the earlier stages of your question, the employment of a large number of these troops who are called or who have been grouped under the rubric of Agnipath is something that the Indian military is constantly trying to adjust and juggle with, and ensure that this does not swallow up an inordinate share of the Indian defense budget. So that's one of the sort of, as you rightly brought out, one of the big discussion points and debating points in Indian defense planning, and something that certainly China and Pakistan look at very carefully as well.
Right. And just for our listeners and viewers, it's not just a question of the active soldiers. It's also a question of soldiers when they retire, because the Indian government obviously guarantees their pensions to some extent. And I think there's some indications that, or reports that there's a perhaps more cynical idea of the Agnipath scheme, because I don't think the Agnipath graduates are entitled to a pension that the normal Indian army Jawan might be. Do you think that this is not just a question of amassing the volume of troops required to defend the Chinese or Pakistan borders, but also perhaps a cost-saving thing, so that the Indian state isn't burdened with pensions in the long term, that it could be diverting these funds towards capital modernization?
See, Tushar, this is all about pensions and payments and money and allocation of sort of inter-se competing loyalties or claimants to the money that India puts aside for defense. We have a situation where approximately 70% of India's defense budget, which India as a poor country can ill afford anyway, 70% of that budget goes towards salaries, pensions, medical benefits and facilities for ex-soldiers, and so on. And that leaves just about 30% for equipment maintenance and for buying sort of and modernizing its defense kit into terms of like modern aircraft, modern tanks, and so on. So this is it has been a sort of a discussion point for a long time now. And the Modi government finally came out with sort of hard concrete action to reduce the sort of budget that was being allocated to manpower and to give a larger share of that budget to defense equipment and maintenance. There is no question of giving pension to sort of somebody who's being sort of paid and treated under this scheme, for the simple reason that the whole purpose of the scheme itself is to just cut down on pensions and so on. And they do that by allocating sort of a smaller amount to sort of cut down on the expenditures, as it were. There is so far, as we would say, the jury is out on whether this is a good scheme, a bad scheme, a successful scheme, or a scheme that will arouse resentment amongst soldiers who are getting a pension, having served a longer period of time, vis-a-vis soldiers who are not getting a pension because they were just pulled out after 3 years or 4 years and merged into the normal working populace of the Republic of India. So I sort of, if I was to give my own personal view on this, which you are at perfect liberty to reject, it is that the scheme so far has yielded a sort of a better equipment to manpower sort of expenditure than existed earlier. As a consequence of which, some of the sort of large amounts of money that go to defense in India, it's being somewhat rationalized. There are some sort of some sense is coming into the disorder that actually constitutes the allocation of expenditures in India. But let's see. There are many sort of imponderables that are still sort of at play here. For example, the continued sort of employment of soldiers, retired soldiers. Right now, they are being accommodated in certain forms of government, such as, like you have people dedicated to paramilitary organizations and so on. So that is still being examined, but let's see for now. It certainly seems to have come under some control, even though sort of many people are sort of a little skeptical about these grandiose titles that are used for it, like Agnipath and so on, which are actually Bollywood titles. And sort of many argue that they don't form a place in serious defense planning.
Well, I suppose there's a diverse range of views for want of a better word, the Dhurandarization of India's military terms and propaganda. But that's
yes, yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah. But that's interesting because I want to ask about one of the biggest issues that I think that India, as a major player in the Indo-Pacific, as you mentioned, should be facing, and that's the structural reforms. India remains one of the very few major military powers that doesn't have a published national security strategy. And its plans to integrate its 3 services into joint theater commands, which considering India's extensive land and naval boundaries, you would imagine should be a priority, but this remains largely unfulfilled. I wonder if you could explain why these structural reforms have been so difficult to implement and carry out, and who or what is behind the resistance. And do you think that, given the concerns with Agnipath that were there earlier, as well as this different nature of security threats that India is facing, there are valid reasons or concerns behind this resistance, or is it just bureaucratic inertia?
It's anybody's guess. I mean, I think that certainly if one looks at it from a historical point of view, uh, it is, it comes to mind immediately to anybody who's asking an intelligent question that why has India not sort of, as you brought out yourself, why is India not allocated resources and allocated interstate tasks for various branches of the military in a manner that would sort of answer many of the questions that you just asked, which is that why so much here and why so much there? The fact of the matter remains that when we became independent as a country in 1947, a lot of the money that was being allocated for defense could not be sort of made up for the simple reason that we just did not have that kind of funding. And interstate priorities of healthcare, medical expenditure, and other sort of competing priorities were sucking up a larger share of the budget. So even though India had to sort of make the allocations for its own defense, it was doing so at considerable cost. And as a consequence of that, the government did not want to start allocating in a sort of a proportion that they could not sustain in the days ahead. And they didn't want to find themselves in an embarrassing situation where they were explaining why they were earlier spending so much and why had they switched over to lesser expenditure. So the fact also remained that that point at the end of the Second World War, in 1947 was when India became independent, just 2 years after the end of the Second World War. There was sort of a lot of influence and pressure coming by the victorious powers of the Second World War onto countries like India, which had always traditionally provided cannon fodder, as it were, for the soldiers and for the sort of the manpower that was still needed to order the world. They had just finished the greatest sort of war of all time, and they wanted to have sort of the right amount of people, preferably coming from the right places, which is cannon fodder like India, being allocated to these sort of tasks. So the consequence and the sort of upshot of it was that they did not do too much of debating or too much of sort of serious thinking about why they were allocating X amount from the Indian sort of army, which was by the end of the Second World War, it was a couple of million people. And why was sort of India not giving a larger share to another competing priority? So anyway, it sort of changed over the years. India realized that it had to sort of look after its own interests on a higher priority than the interests of Western powers, who were still trying to rule this part of the globe. And the consequence was that some of these competing priorities were allocated and addressed and became became points that were sort of useful for a newly independent country like India, whereas some other things like, just to give you an example, expeditionary capabilities of a country like India, because let's say the United Kingdom wanted to get a hold on the insurgency in Malaysia. So for centuries, that role had been performed by India at India's cost, and which is what colonialism is all about. But the upshot was that India had to sort of weigh its costs and benefits, and as a result of which we are still today trying to arrive at sort of answers and allocations and proportions that make sense for a country like India.
I suppose that makes sense when you consider India's early, independent history and the requirements it had in terms of development. But I wonder what, not excuse, but what reasons are there today that slow down stuff like, joint theater commands or more, tri-service integration or even publishing a national security strategy? Because one would expect that given India's, its self perhaps described image as a, future great power and a major player in the region, why would it not undertake steps that I think there's somewhat of a consensus on, um, that would be important for India's defense strategy in the future? What do you think is the hesitation here?
For example, what would you sort of, yeah, it might be easier to understand just by virtue of working it through an example. What competing priority would India, in your opinion, sort of have that would make better sense for an independent India, and yet a poor country, India? What would make better sense for that? Let's work, talk our way through this.
Well, I always, my understanding was that, having a published national security strategy, like let's say the US or EU or China does, um, might give not just a signal to allies and, partners in defense about India's long-term priorities, but more importantly, a signal to, defense producers and private defense manufacturers. We had an admiral on last episode, who talked about the importance of the private sector in naval production and manufacturing. And without a national security strategy and without sort of a long-term vision that's on paper and therefore is more of a commitment, I wonder if that signal is missing. But you don't think so? I'm very curious about how you see this.
No, I am actually in complete agreement with you. There is, and the Republic of India itself has clearly sort of done the thinking on this issue. And as a consequence of that, a lot of these changes are gradually coming about. For example, we talked about India as a poor country, sort of reaching that stage soon after independence, where you needed to allocate different tasks for different sort of soldiers. It is, it's a function of competing national interests. And, there was, as colonialism receded during that period, there was this complete sort of new thinking process where a country like India, which was allocated and which was culturally attuned more towards, let's say, the United Kingdom and the Anglo-Saxon world, than it was to Russia and the Warsaw Pact countries of that time. And it became apparent pretty quickly that India was out of step in what it was putting down and arguing and sort of claiming was its interests in the Anglo-Saxon world, and what were the sort of the directions that it was actually going, which were more aligned towards the non-Anglo-Saxon world. So this was a debate that still continues to this date. We are still hearing about India buying Russian arms and why is it buying Russian arms and so on. So I think that this will take another couple of decades to be resolved. But India, by virtue of just the numbers, its defense budget, its manpower strength, uh, will eventually sort of reach some kind of modus vivendi where it will look more to its own interests than it will look towards the interests of sort of various pressure groups that are at work in the corridors of power.
And that's a fascinating insight because for so long, the Indian Army, which is a successor to the British Indian Army, functioned as an extension of Britain's wider colonial interests. And after independence, even though the army's structure and command had that tradition, they had to adapt themselves almost to a new reality and new priorities, which, as you mentioned, does make that transition take a lot of time. So I want to get to the other issues. Definitely want to talk about the Russian question of India's equipment, as it were, the idea of procurement, as well as a bit more detail on the two-front threat and the future of land warfare. But just before that, we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Colonel Ajai Shukla. So welcome back to Beyond the Indus with Colonel Ajai Shukla. So, Colonel Shukla, I want to move on to the question of India's defense procurement and its equipment troubles, because India has set ambitious targets under its Atmanirbhar Bharat plan for indigenous defense production. Yet, you've been critical of the fact that this plan tends to favor public sector producers and undertakings as opposed to private sector participation, which is pretty important if you want to make this indigenization plan for defense equipment realistic. At the same time, India gets over 60% of its inventory, which remains of Soviet or Russian origin, which is unfortunately a dependency that might lead to supply chain risks if you're getting equipment from Russia, especially if you look at the Ukraine conflict and the supply chain shortages for certain munitions and equipment since then. I wonder if you could talk about this indigenization policy and what a credible approach to localizing production of defense equipment might look like. Is there a realistic path out of dependency on foreign arms that India can achieve, or is that simply impractical given the requirements of modern defense equipment and supply chains?
Tushar, I think that there is no doubt about one thing, and that is that over-dependence on one particular source of supply, especially when it comes to weapons and equipment for the military, is unwise. No matter how reliable the supplier, and Russia has been a truly reliable supplier to India for much of its much of the duration of the military history of these two countries so far. But even Russia has tended to sort of structure its supplies and costs and so on in a manner that favors Russian suppliers rather than Indian suppliers. And that's hardly surprising that it goes in this direction. But there are other suppliers that have been sidelined, as it were, as a consequence of this reliance on Russia. And the upshot of that is that, to name a couple of them, France, Israel, and now gradually creeping onto the horizon is Germany as well. These countries are now coming up as alternatives for India. It is probably and that's the way the cookie crumbles. It's probably going to happen that America is going to take the place of many of these suppliers, for the simple reason that the strategic advantages of dealing with a huge industrial estate like the United States has is something that endows the buyer with certain advantages, and that is in terms of not just the cost, but in terms of the delivery, the the sort of the other advantages that accrue as a consequence of dealing with a superpower and so on. So there are certainly clear advantages in dealing with America, and India has, in addition to sort of an ideological bias, as it were, against against American supply. India has sort of come off second best in many of the purchases that it has done, because the buyer in this particular case, the seller, I beg your pardon, the United States, just has so much of leverage and so much of sort of financial power that goes with buying from it. So I think that the advantages are being examined. The advantages are being sort of criticized in many forums. But as of now, the advantage is coming into the sort of coming into the how should I put it, into the whole deal whenever you're talking about America buying from India. And let's see how this goes. The Americans are sort of very hard-nosed in the way that they sort of strike deals with India and so on, but they have been greatly sort of appreciated by the Indian armed forces for the reliability of their equipment, for the sort of cost benefits that they give, and all in all, the downside of Russian equipment, which is that it comes loaded with all kinds of responsibilities and sort of other things. Those get sort of wiped away by dealing in a sort of more coherent way with America.
And I suppose, the expanding in, localization of defense production for certain kinds of equipment, you think that is, too ambitious a plan, or is that the direction that India is going to move into in the long term?
Localizing production is almost invariably an advantage for the buyer. That is, if we're buying from the United States, it makes sense to buy as much as you can from the United States. And the advantages that accrue from that are manifold. They're not just advantages of sort of price and of sort of delivery. They are advantages that come in the costing of the equipment, and in the sort of ability of the buyer, that's in this case us, to insist on certain sort of capability advantages, certain advantages in terms of guaranteed availability of a particular piece of equipment, rather than sort of just relying on the sort of seller to sort of give it to you at a good price. So equipment which is now being bought, whether from America or whether from France, comes with a sort of what they call percentage guarantees. And that basically means that a certain proportion of the equipment has to be available to India at all times. They cannot say that, there is only 25% availability at this point in time. You'll have to make do with that. So there are all these advantages that sort of India is gradually beginning to invoke and to insist upon. And these are advantages that come as a consequence of Atmanirbharta. So I think that for the time being, India is being able to hold its own in this particular branch of the market, which is to do with logistics mainly. But let's see how it goes forward from here.
So I want to ask about the China challenge, as it were, and the threat of the two fronts that India is facing. So, you've written that it may not be the best option for India to actually face a two-front conflict because it would be logistically and in terms of resource commitment just very difficult if it were to have a conflict with both China and Pakistan at the same time. And also, given that the PLA has undergone a lot of modernization in recent years, which makes it present a much more formidable threat than it has historically, at least in comparative terms. I wonder if you could talk about how India fares right now against the PLA in a hypothetical war scenario on the Indo-Tibetan frontier. How wide is the gap, and what do you think a more credible approach to this two-front idea might be?
Yeah, to sort of put one thing to rest straight away is it would be an absolute disaster of Indian foreign policy if we had to fight two major powers at the same time. Diplomacy has to be about shaping the battlefield to your advantage. And this certainly has to be the key advantage that Indian diplomacy generates as a result of talking to China and Pakistan, so that we have to deal with only one enemy at the most at one time. China is there is no other sort of comparable enemy that is growing at the rate that China is growing, that is developing its weaponry and its tools of war in the manner that China is doing. And we have to make sure that we do not deal with Pakistan and China at the same time. It is been well understood by these two competing states that India would be looking to divert us and to deal with us as separate entities at the same time. And therefore, we must guard against that. And that is why Pakistan, every time that we have had a conflict with them, has taken up as a sort of core objective pressure from China that they want China to put on India, so that India is under a certain additional degree of pressure. But India is, I think, beginning to sort of see the advantages and disadvantages of this, and good kudos to them for doing so. As a consequence of this realization, India has diverted a sort of significant amount of its military strength from the China border, or from the Pakistan border, to the Chinese border. And Pakistan has always said and argued quite convincingly at that, that if India claims that its only enemy and potential threat is against Pakistan, then how is it that all its key battle formations, like the armored divisions and the strike formations for the planes, why are all of those arrayed against Pakistan? And this is a difficult question for India to answer, except that India has now recently addressed this question. They have broken down one strike corps and placed it and repositioned it and repurposed it to sort of make it against China rather than against Pakistan. So now, whereas we had at one stage about 70% of our equipment arrayed against Pakistan, with only 30% arrayed against China, now it's come closer to 45-55, with a larger sort of array against Pakistan. So now, not that has made a huge difference so far, but it is a sort of a pressure point that India has created, and something that Pakistan is able to use, not just to argue the India argument, but also Pakistan has been able to deal with its internal politics in a manner that the threat from India is visible as a slightly lower threat than what it was before.
As a last question, we talked about Operation Sindoor. We talked about the changes that have come on since Ukraine. And I want to ask about the future of land warfare, particularly in South Asia and particularly for India, because, India's army is largely structured around your traditional, combined arms warfare. But we're increasingly seeing, bigger powers moving towards multi-domain operations and in particular integrating AI and autonomous systems and drones into their combat operations. I wonder how you see India advancing around that path and how India might transform its land warfare doctrine to include more of these new developments in the battlefield. What do you think it might take for India to make this conceptual and structural leap to adapt effectively to the threats on its frontiers using these new technologies?
There is no choice for India in this. We absolutely have to keep up with the sort of modernization and the different the different variations of combat and its associated activities. We can no longer rely on foreign suppliers for changing the sort of patterns and operations and the sort of very approach and doctrines, as you brought out earlier in our conversation. These have to change. We will be doing ourselves a great favor by doing this faster rather than slower. The Chinese are they've got it pinned down exactly where they want it. The sort of expenditure that they are incurring, the technology levels that they are having to deal with, all of these are now positioned by China in a manner that suits its best. So, we really have no choice but to respond in a like manner to sort of make sure that we don't have Pakistan constantly seeing us as a threat, or the sort of step beyond that also, which is to constantly start dealing with us in a manner that, one would only sort of evoke a hostile response. So I think that these are changes that India is having to make and is making. And good luck to us. We're going to have to do this. We can't continue endlessly spending on defense, especially when there are alternatives that call for greater spending.
So it's not just a question of getting the best technology and the best arms, but also a question of deploying other tactics like diplomacy in order to manage the threats on our borders and to give India the strategic space it requires in order to advance its own domestic priorities, which ultimately is the most important aspect if it wants to become a great power in the long run. But that obviously is a question that we're going to be observing over the next few decades. But for now, Colonel Shukla, thank you so much for your insights.
It was a great pleasure talking to you.